I've always kind of been fascinated by the mysteries of the deep sea, so when the opportunity arose to scuba dive in the murky depths of the Puget Sound, I couldn't resist. I knew very little about scuba diving, but I'd had an instructor with me, two in fact, as well as a small group of other very beginner divers. It was a super misty morning. A layer of fog was still over the water when we'd walked our way in. I was from Everett, but Mukilteo practically sits right beside it, but it's got some of the most beautiful views and a spot well known for diving. Right between a beautiful hotel and some off-limits oil docks. The area is rather peaceful, to say the least, compared to the main beach or the lighthouse park. I found myself descending into the chilly waters off the coast. We weren't head under quite yet, but I could hardly wait to explore the world just beneath me and surrounding me. There was a period of time where I felt so comfortable I almost lost focus on the instructor and what they were saying. Luckily, it was all repeated. Finally, submerged. It was much quieter than I expected it to be. Only the sound of my own breathing through the gear mingled with the almost eerie silence. I navigated the underwater space through the kelp forests. I realized it was also darker than I expected. Everything, including myself, swayed with a gentle current. I was calm, and then I wasn't. An unexplainable unease began to settle within me. It was as if an invisible force would snatch me into the darkness at any given moment. It felt as if I was being watched for sure. I tried to tell myself, "You're with people. It's probably just an actual person." Though I knew deep in my gut, the same gut screaming for me to get away, there wasn't a fellow diver in those dark shadows of the water, but someone, something, watching my every move, was in the shadows. Just as I was about to resurface, a spectral figure materialized before me, underneath the surface. The ghostly apparition was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Translucent and ethereal, much lighter than the shadow it seemed to emerge from. It shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and at first I thought it was some sort of jellyfish, but I saw its eyes, as piercing as any bright light. Just for a moment, they were fixed on me, causing me to increase my speed to the surface. Still, I was so curious about what I'd seen. Surely those weren't eyes. Now that I'd had a moment to think, I considered that maybe I had in fact seen another diver, that the light had been their headlamp, too, somehow. I didn't have mine on at the time, but maybe I should have. I lowered myself closer to the seabed, trying to capture a glimpse of its presence again. But as I descended, to my sheer horror, the apparition was directly in front of me. At first, I thought it was mirroring my movements, but I realized, whatever it was swimming away. I rose to the surface again, realizing most of the divers were to the northeast of me. I was the furthest back. I swam closer to the group and descended underwater. I realized even from a distance the divers were much clearer. I could see their details clearly underwater. They weren't remotely transparent or shimmering in any way. I decided to try my luck one more time. I swam back in the direction I just explored, but I felt someone grab my leg. I was completely unprepared for the sensation, and it caused me to panic underwater. Summoning some remaining courage, I propelled myself away from the grip on my leg, my heart pounding in my chest, and even though I had oxygen, I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I needed air. I felt it again, a strong pull on my leg. The water's current seemed to conspire against me, suddenly pushing me further into the sound, away from the safety of the surface, further away from the rest of the group. Just as I thought all hope was lost, an eerie stillness settled around me. There was no longer a grip on my leg, and I seized the opportunity to swim upwards, with all of my might. Breaking through the surface and touching shore, I removed my headgear and gasped for air. Up to that point in life, I'd almost drowned twice. Been stung by a kind of jellyfish that hurt, and been thrown from a four-wheeler into a metal shed. But at that moment, my body was trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and relief like I'd never felt before. I don't doubt that the Puget Sound is a beautiful ecosystem worth exploring, and it's got several good spots. I've just never been back to that spot in particular. The memory of the underwater encounter, it's still vivid in my mind. I decided that I didn't really need to know what it was. Honestly, the moment it tried to pull me under or away, just pull it all, I was done. I'm finally ready to talk about the reason I went back to school last year. Before that, I was working on fishing boats. I don't have a wife or kids, so my time is my own. People always thought that it was weird that I enjoyed spending long stretches at sea, but I always thought that it was weird that they didn't. I figured it was one of those to each their own kind of things, but maybe they knew something I didn't, or just had better instincts. Most of the companies work similar to oil rigs. You go out with your crew for a few weeks, and then you come home to be off for a few weeks. I enjoyed my time off the same way that I did my time on, at sea. For every big industry boat, there are just as many day fishers. And it wasn't uncommon for me to help one out if they fell short-handed. Well, one morning during the summer of 22, I headed down to the docks in hopes of setting out with one of my day crews. My usual guys didn't have any openings, but I did notice a few summer boys arguing over where to find the gas tank, so I decided to introduce myself. Rich kids on college break were my favorite employers. There's no real work to do, so it's basically a babysitting gig. These guys wanted to take out Daddy's boat to get some good pictures for Instagram, but then they got to the docks and didn't know what to do next. There were 3 of them, but I probably shouldn't use their real names, so the owner's son can be Chad, and his buddies can be Sam and Dan. After gassing up, I made my sales pitch and they invited me right along. The only thing they cared about was catching one of those swordfish things, and being back before dark. The home before dark part was a piece of cake, but I'll circle back to the marlin stipulation in a minute. I would have gone for free, but I didn't argue when they gave me $500. It was just before 8 a.m. when we left the dock for a small island that local kids sometimes use for parties. But people never go beyond that point because the other side is surrounded by tail, jagged rocks. One's hidden just beneath the surface. They'll put a hole in your hull before you realize what's happening, and they extend much further than you'd expect from such a small island. But the safe side is big. Like I said, kids party there all the time. I don't want it to sound like I recklessly took them to some dangerous location. We didn't even go to the actual island, only close enough to point it out. We anchored and began fishing around noon. Normally, I would have spent a good half hour explaining a few key differences between regular fishing and deep-sea fishing, but they had done zero research before the trip. With the bait that they had brought along, I didn't have to worry about them hooking a marlin or letting it get away with their pulls. People like that never think about the fact that the fish will unhook itself. The first hour or so went exactly as I expected. Chad and Sam made some nice catches, but didn't want to touch the fish, so I kept taking them off the lines and rebaiting their hooks after the photo op. Dan, however, he learned to bait his own pretty fast because he kept getting robbed. It seemed like we had a good system worked out. After a few beers, I felt comfortable trying some of my own bait to see if I could catch the boys something worthy of posing with, but that turned out to be a nearly fatal mistake. While I was showing off to Chad and Sam, I realized Dan grabbed some of my bait, but even if I had, it really shouldn't have been that big of a deal. That just had to be the one time he set his hook properly. It was instantly clear that something was wrong when the entire boat lurched back hard enough to knock us on our asses. I shouted for Dan to let go, but he couldn't hear me over the loudest splash that I've heard in my life. I don't say that lightly. I've watched my captain fight a great white, and they make a hell of a fuss, but this sounded like a goddamn whale. I didn't need to see it to know that we were in danger. As I rose to my feet, there was a second giant splash, and a hard impact to our starboard side, knocking us all back on our asses. I scrambled to Dan, half crawling, half running, screaming to let go all the while. But as I got closer, I saw that he had. It was stuck on the rails, and he had been trying to turn it so that it would slide through. That's why I usually cover these things before the fishing begins. Once the panic starts, it's hard to utilize common sense. I began screaming, cut it," instead. But the words fell dead on my lips when the coil of a giant pale green serpent's body rose above the water and dropped onto the railing where the rod was stuck, smashing everything it impacted into splinters. The boat rocked to an almost 90-degree angle before slamming back into the water. Just before Dan could fall through the broken rails, I rushed to my feet to look over the side, just in time to see the last 6 feet of this tail disappear beneath the waves. I've spent my entire life on the ocean, but I've never seen anything like what we saw that day. It was like a giant anaconda left over from the Jurassic period. I've heard countless old sailors talk about creatures like it, but monster legends and sailing go hand in hand. Knowing what I do know now, it makes me wonder what other stories are true. And how many of the boating accidents by that island were actually from jagged rocks. Obviously, we returned to the docks immediately after that, but I haven't been able to go back out on the water since.